Marie, thank you so much, and all my thanks go to Mark Spiegel, to Noah Horowitz, of course to Marie, to Art Basel Miami, to Proto Cinema, as well as also to Gavin Brown, to Roland Augustine, and everybody else who helped us make this amazing encounter today possible. It's a dream come true to have AJ and Jason with us here today, and it's also a world premiere because we have collaborated, but I've never done a talk together in public. So please join me in giving them again a very, very warm welcome. Yeah, we have a problem with the mic. Thank you so much. And actually, exactly 1 year ago, the very same day, we were here with Claudia Rankin and Glenn Ligon talking about the necessity of new structures and new institutions in what they refer to state of emergency, or as Toni Morrison said, this is precisely the time when artists go to work. So we're going to discuss today many different things, hopefully, of course, the collaboration between Jason and AJ, the principle of this series, and it is wonderful that this series can evolve, because there's nothing better than having these long durational, conferences which can really evolve over time, and I'm very grateful to Art Basel that for many years now we can do a series where we invite artists to talk about practitioners who inspire them. And at the beginning it was very much about artists, and artists would invite visual artists from previous generations. But then very soon the series actually became much more interdisciplinary, and visual artists would invite poets or composers or scientists whose work is an inspiration for them. The dialogue with AJ started, I would say, about 18 months ago, and we've spoken at least once a week ever since, because we started to work on this exhibition, a series of utterly improbable yet extraordinary renditions, which happened at the Serpentine Gallery in London, in Kensington Gardens. And from the very beginning, when we invited AJ to do this exhibition, he talked not only about influence, but he talked also about actually an exhibition being a possibility of ushering to other practices. He wanted to involve Ming Smith, the legendary photographer, in the exhibition, a photographer who inspired him a lot. So here we have this idea of the influencer series, but he also wanted to involve with Frida Orupabu and Miscellaneous, two artists until this exhibition, unknown in the visual art world, whose work is mostly seen on social media, Miscellaneous on YouTube and Frida on Instagram. When we talked about the exhibition, we of course also talked about public program, and AJ came up with this amazing idea of doing a listening session, which was this collaboration with Jason. It's actually an idea of a dismembered jazz ensemble who actually performed separately in different sites in London, but I'm sure both Jason and AJ are going to tell us more about that. And then the sounds were actually brought together in the Serpentine, and besides Jason, it involved Steve Coleman, Morgan Kraft, Mika Gore, Melvin Gibbs. We're very delighted that Melvin is here with us today, as well as also Kokai Carl Walker. So this idea, of course, of collaboration is very present in both of your practices, as well as the interdisciplinarity. When we discussed the panel today, we spoke a lot about Jason's interdisciplinary works and this idea of never-ending experimentations, and that, of course, leads us also, and I wanted to mention this here very briefly as an homage to Zaha Hadid, because whenever I'm in Miami, I think of our late friend Zaha Hadid, the great architect who built our gallery in London, in Kensington Gardens, and who so tragically passed away last year in Miami. And the day of the opening of the Serpentine, she wrote this amazing sentence on a piece of paper. She said, "There should be no end to experimentation," and I think that is very much what brings together the practice of Jason and AJ, an endless experimentation. I wanted to begin with the beginning and ask AJ about influence and tell us a little bit about your early influences. We did a conversation actually at LACMA, a public conversation, which was very much focused on that, together with Bettina Korek. And in this conversation, you said that there were these two very important early influences. There was Alien, and there was also Stanley Kubrick, 2001. Can you tell us a little bit about those?
Um, yeah, it's funny. Like sometimes when people tell me something that I said before, I was like, I don't know, is that still true? It may be true, but I don't know if I still believe it. But certainly 2001 had a really profound influence on me. I've written about this, so if you've read my little accounting of it, I'm repeating myself. But my godmother, Mrs. Herbine Reese, had given me a copy of the novel when I was like 10. So I read the book. Couldn't make much sense of it, honestly. And then at the time, Popular Mechanics, which was the equivalent then of, like, I guess they have all these special effects magazines and stuff, but they didn't really have that then. This is in the late 60s, early 70s, but for 3 or 4 years prior to the movie coming out, they would have these stories in Popular Mechanics about, the special effects and all this kind of stuff. So I was really, really desperate to see the film. I remember it came to a drive-in like a year after it had been released. It came to a drive-in in Clarksdale, Mississippi, which is where I grew up, and was just there for one weekend, and my father was supposed to take me, and I know something came up with work or something, he was too tired and we needed to go. And even to this day, it's still one of the greatest early disappointments of my life. So maybe a year and a half later, it finally came to the proper theater in Clarksdale, West End Cinema, which is on the white side of town. So to even go there was still essentially a segregated town. But my parents dropped me off there to see a matinee, and as I've recounted before, I guess there were about 9 people there when it started, and by the end it was just me, as far as I can remember. During the matinee, because they had a matinee break in the middle of the movie, but when it came up, I was like the only person in there. And I couldn't make heads or tails of that film. It just kind of, it literally blew my mind. And I remember, like, distinctly, walking out afterwards in a bit of a daze. And, I remember the light, the quality of the light and everything. It's one of those moments. I remember the lint in the air, floating around in the light. And there was just one person there that was like the manager who was in the ticket booth, and he was reading the newspaper. And I just, 10-year-old black kid, I walked over to him and, excuse me, sir. I just came out of this movie. Can you tell me what it was about? And my man, he was just reading the newspaper like this, and he sort of looked over his newspaper down at me and just said, son, I've been looking at it all week and I don't have a clue. And that's all I remember. I don't really remember how I got home or anything. It was just sort of, so that film had a really, really profound impact on me. I think, I've thought about it a long time afterwards. In some ways that film just did. I used to say I felt buried alive in the film. And almost any time I've had confrontations with artworks that were not just difficult so much, but they just transformed. You know what I mean? Like I was shook by it. They transformed my understanding of what a work could do. Albert Eiler, of course. A lot of different people. Cecil Taylor, of course. I remember Stan Brakhage. I remember back to those instances. And then, you have those feelings, like even the kind of disorientation in the face of the work. And then over time, it's harder and harder, more difficult to get that feeling, whatever that vibe was. So for a long time, I was like really preoccupied with was the effect of the work on me had to do at the age that I was, you know what I mean? Because I was 10 and I didn't have, enough of an understanding what was going on. But I've seen that same work like at 30 or 40, and it still has the same effect. So I've thought a lot about over the years, like how do you create that effect in the audience, especially, a mature viewer. I know jazz, to me, at its best does. It always get that sense of discovery. There's something quantum about it almost. It's not like, because I used to always wonder, like, if jazz musicians are improvising, it seems fresh, and then when people transcribe those things and play them back, it doesn't seem fresh, even though they might be hitting the same notes, or not as fresh. So what's that about? Is there some kind of quantum dimension that has to do with when you actually make a thing in real time? Even if it's a recording of a thing, that was made in a certain kind of way versus something that was, i.e., composed or practiced or something like that. So those are like the perennial questions. So for me, like even, I'm rambling now, but like even with something like 2001, like later when Miles Davis sort of kind of superseded that movie as probably the single, greatest sort of influence on my idea of what art could do. I always think like there was something about 2001 that's very similar to the quality, a certain quality that Miles's work has. Like sometimes I've described it as, the context changed over the years, but his sound, I used to say I thought it was both austere and voluptuous at the same time, which is a difficult thing to do because those are almost two contradictory terms. And I think 2001 has a lot of that same qualities, both like emptied out and almost too much at the same time, emotionally too much. So anyway, I'm rambling.
And when we spoke about the panel, you said you wanted really to connect to music and invite Jason. And it's kind of interesting because I was reading again this morning an old interview where you said that kind of connection to music was there from the very beginning because you studied architecture, and that is your first love to this day, and that in a way there were the same preoccupations already there when you wanted to become an architect. You said you wanted to make a house that's like kind of blue, or a house that's like Electric Daisy, and so on. And then of course, once you went and connected more to film, that was the same logic. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I mean, fundamentally, I think my orientation is more like towards ideas. I mean, I think I spent the bigger part of my life thinking about things, and some of that was, I don't know, this is my narrative about it now. This is the most recent narrative, or it's where it's settled. And it has something to do with growing up in a place like Clarksdale, Mississippi, which is in the Delta, and I felt like a lot of my early, developmental years I would define by kind of deprivation. There was definitely, deprivations are interesting because it's relative. Because you go to other parts of the world and people seem like they don't have anything, they seem relatively all right. Or you come back here and you see something and it seems like the person's house or something is like, impoverished. But that would be a great house if you were in some other part of the world. So this stuff is real relative, but it was something about going back and forth between Clarksdale, Mississippi, where I grew up, and Tupelo, Mississippi, which is where I was born. It made that kind of explicit. I felt it because they were two very, very different kinds of environments, But so it's something about when you're reading about other people doing things or being exposed to things, but you're not doing things yourself. I mean, we were living, but I always felt like for a long part of my life, I was a consumer of people doing things. Like the big early person who was doing things for a lot of people in my generation would be Michael Jackson. Like he was doing things, because he was like a kid, and he was on Ed Sullivan. He was a black kid. There was like, maybe 2 or 3 black people on TV, period. And then he had a Saturday morning cartoon. That shit was incredible, for a black kid to have a Saturday morning cartoon. And, so Michael Jackson, to me, he was a person I always tracked myself against. Later, maybe like Prince or something like that. But, these were people who were actually doing things. And I felt like I was never really doing anything. I was just thinking about things. And then at some point, I remember like when I went to Howard University in D.C., and I had always read about things that I didn't have access to, like a Godard film. I always read by Godard. And I get to D.C., and I can go see a Godard film. And I remember going to see all these Godard films, and they were just nothing like what I had imagined. I mean, it was like so far off what I had imagined. And at a certain point, I realized the things that I had imagined, I had created myself in a way. They were like my own creations. So basically, for me, I realized at a certain point that I was always driven by the idea of the thing. And the idea of the thing was like always modeled to a certain degree on music. Because the idea was fundamentally always bound up with the idea of like, what is the most fully manifested version of yourself? And that self, there's an individual, unquantifiable part of that. That's me, that's AJ, that's real specific to growing up in Mississippi and all these kinds of things. But there's another part of that, just because of all the structures of constraint that black people have to function inside of it that had to do just with being black, So music was always the space where black people seemed so much more fully actualized. And so music has always been a point of reference for me when I even imagined what's possible. So early on, like Hans was saying, when I was studying architecture, I would have said it, at the time I would have said something like, like kind of blue if it was a house, what would it look like? Now, I would probably articulate those things differently. So when I sort of started moving around in terms of like the space, the medium that I was operating in, when I shifted from architecture to film, then it was the same question. So the medium itself just seemed like not incidental, you know what I mean? But it's really not about the medium. It's about the idea of like how can you fully manifest a thing? How can you make a thing that feels powerfully embodied? How can you make an artifact, whether it's an immaterial artifact, as in music, or cinema is a kind of immaterial artifact, or if it's a sculpture, a painting, a photograph, or something. How do you make these things so that they have the same kind of fraud, alienated, distressed, magnificent, depressed, abject, all the things it can be as we have, you know what I mean? Like black people can be broken down and majestic at the same time. And how do you actually make a thing that seems to be able to embody some of that? So.
And you also said that music is a great place to actually think through ideas that you can also share with people. And that, of course, leads us directly to Jason. I wanted to ask you the same question about kind of beginnings and very early influences. I found this 1989 quote where something happened in 1989 where actually it's the year also Tim Berners-Lee invented the World Wide Web. It's of course the year the Berlin Wall fell. It's the year also of Tiananmen, and it's in 1989 that in Houston you actually encountered the music of Thelonious Monk. Can you tell us about what happened in '89?
There was, recounting your memory is never accurate, but I will say that I walked into my parents' room and they were watching television, and there was a plane crash of some politicians, some black politicians, and one of them was a great politician in Houston, Texas, where I'm from, called Mickey Leland, and he was on this delegation. And so he had died in this plane crash, and my parents knew him, but they were watching, their Trinitron TV, but with no sound on the TV. But they were listening to a solo piano recording of Thelonious Monk at the same time. So instead of listening to the report or the reporters, they only had Thelonious Monk as like music for mourning. And I don't know, you talk about like this kind of being in a space where you're not sure of what's taking control of the space, of the image, of the sound, but you're in the room with it, and it's having an effect on you. And somehow walking into the room and feeling my parents' silence in that moment, but them only letting Thelonious Monk be the sound they needed to have for that moment was triggered a lot, because I had not heard his music. I didn't know who he was at all. And somehow here he was playing also his most famous composition, Round Midnight, just by himself. And for me, the most powerful recording that he's made of that song. And I went to the record player and I looked at who was on the cover, and I was like, I want to be him. Whoever can do this to a room, that's kind of what I know music can do. And I had been practicing Suzuki piano up until that time, which was great, because that kind of instilled in my hand the moment that then I would run into Thelonious Monk and prepare me to say, okay, so now you want to enter this territory? This is also how technique changes, right? And the woman who got me to that place was two women, my mother and Yelena Karnets, this first-generation Russian teacher who was in Houston making sure people were learning how to play piano correctly. And she was demanding as a teacher. So all those years then lead me up to hearing Thelonious Monk and deciding my hand did not know how to do that. So what was I missing in my technique? And then I had to start trying to figure out how to get that. That began like a serious journey that I never would have thought would help me understand what the power of music really was, you know. And you talk about this thing about like what we take for granted so easily is where we hear music and how we hear it, whether we hear it on our phone, on our ringtone, or whether we hear it in the elevator, or whether we hear it in a restaurant, or where we even at an event where they've hired a musician and they're in there. And in those moments, you know, what is the musician facing? You know, musicians who know that music can be transportive are deciding to restrain themselves and not transport you, but only get my check at the end of the day. These are things that I didn't want to be a part of. I didn't want to have my music function that way. And so I built the rest of my time here trying to figure out a way to get to that moment that Monk was able to do for my parents. You know.
And then, of course, another influence, your teacher, Jackie Byard. Can you tell us about what you kind of learned from Jackie?
Well, the piano player Jackie Byard played most famously with Charles Mingus and Eric Dolphy. And when I moved to New York City to go to Manhattan School of Music, he was on the piano faculty there. And he was a historian, but he does not teach history. And he doesn't wag his finger and say in this very jazz traditional way, which is you need to learn this. He just said, this is how you can be free in this. You know, this is how you can be free in learning the music of your predecessors. So I don't know, that wasn't really the mode of teaching the history of jazz. It was more you had to be functioning within the history rather than free in the history. And he never confined himself technically in that way. And also he would be in lessons and he'd be smoking his cigarette during the lesson. This is in a small room in the 90s, smoking. He would spray his piano if somebody else touched it with disinfectant. Except one day he brought in Raid and he sprayed his piano with Raid. You know, this is that brother. this is the guy I spent 4 years with every Monday, 2 pianos, you know. And my great respect for him, because there's 2 things also happening. One is like I have great respect, and this is who I want to be. This man played with Charlie Parker. Like he's done that, right? He's made that history. It's all cataloged. It's on these recordings. But the other side was, this is what it is to be an artist, right? And this is how you teach. You unlock things in the student, you know. When I first got there, he said to me, oh, you used to play some classical music? Oh, you know, you need to tell your mother to send you those books, you know. Like I have him saying this in the first lessons. His relationship to his family, he kept in his work. Like he kept it side by side. Because he knew almost, and most importantly, that was his relationship to abstraction, was even trying to understand his mother, his wife, or his children. And he was murdered in his home in 1999 in Queens. Someone broke into his home looking for his son who had gone wayward and murdered him, shot him in the face. You know, and when something happens like that to a teacher, like a person who I regard as for really showing me the path hand to hand, then I know that also my mission here is it ain't arbitrary. It ain't here to be fun. You know, it's here to be serious. It's here to be demanding. It's here to teach others. And so when I come into contact with people like AJ, who also like challenge these notions or have thought about music in a way that I never have, then I know that these are the places that I need to be.
Before we talk about the concrete collaboration between the 2 of you, I wanted to ask you to tell us a little bit more about the multiple artist collaboration. The other day I was in Julie Merito's studio and she told me about this amazing kind of parallel reality where she would paint and you would improvise with sound. Charles Gaines is here, which is wonderful because of course he and you collaborated. The other day I also had a conversation with Kara Walker who told me about the many collaborations you did, where you did sound for her films, of course, but also collaborations actually with live performance. Can you tell us a little bit about these different artist collaboration and what it means for you?
Well, as a pianist, your job is to just accompany all the time. The job of the pianist most around the world is just to accompany. It's not to be a solo instrument, it's just to actually back up someone else. And in the relationship that I've had with jazz, where I play with a lot of different people, I also know that relationship folds outside of the genre or the discipline. And over the years, really kind of, you know, meeting people and having conversations, and then that moment where, you know, experimentation never ends, then people want to know, well, what's the next chapter in this body of work? So from those people you mentioned to Adrian Piper and Joan Jonas, Glenn Ligon, Adam Pendleton, Stan Douglas, Julie, Cara, you know, and the list is quite long, but it's also, these are things that then I take back to my piano studio and talk to my students about, which is a relationship where you have people thinking about sound that aren't coming at it from the vantage point of using an instrument. And so how do people trigger those things forward? And it's almost necessary to pull people out of their folder that they sit themselves in. And these artists, you know, Adrian Piper and Joan Jonas most specifically pulled me way out of my folder at the moment my mother passed. Meeting those two women and having very long dialogues and relationships with them has totally changed my trajectory as an artist.
And I think now we should talk about the listening session, and maybe to give a little bit of context for that. So we invited Jana Peel and I and our teams invited AJ actually about 18 months ago, a little bit more than a year ago, to do this exhibition at the Serpentine, and it was an experience where we learned every day how to actually think about an exhibition differently. As I already said, AJ undermined this idea of a solo show by saying, you know, a show should usher also to other practices, make the exhibition a space of generosity. And at the same time, you also challenged this idea that we would just do the exhibition at the gallery by basically saying, you know, it's not enough. I mean, we have 1.2 million visitors every year. It's free admission. But you said that's not enough. We need to go into the city. We need to go into different neighborhoods. We cannot just assume that everybody comes, you know, to our space. So from the very beginning, you excluded basically Love is the Message, you know, from the show and wanted it to be presented in a specially, you know, built tent in different parts of London. And that idea of the multi-site, of course, led then also to the listening session, because when we discussed with the curator, Amira Gard, who curated the exhibition, Lizzie Carey-Thomas, who is the head of our programs, and then also with Claude Agile, who curates the public program, and you about what could be the public, you know, programs, you decided and very strongly suggested that that should be a multi-site event. And maybe we could start from there, and you could tell us a little bit about the vision of this extremely unusual event of a multi-site kind of concert. It's even not a concert, it's actually a new format, I would say.
I don't know why I found this funny, but no, it's just like, look, the main thing for me is just play. Just making space to play, you know, and, you know, just like I said, just having ideas, trying to figure out ideas that make it possible to engage other people, to interact with other people I respect. I mean, to a certain degree, so much of it is like, how can I come up with an idea where I can fly X, Y, and Z in and can sit around? I mean, some of my best fun on it, like the show was fun, but I have a very particular memory of just sitting in the hotel room the morning of, because I was like, you know, had my little, I had done it like chopped and screwed kind of, but rough, real rough, like of this gospel song, and I just, you know, was prepared for everybody to say, well, but everybody was like, wow, that's interesting, don't do nothing to it, you know, it's really rough. So in some ways, it's like, look at my little thing, it's like an opportunity to have, you know, essentially the best, in my opinion, the best musicians on the face of the earth, and then you can get your little rinky-dinky thing to them, and they get to listen to it, and then they try to make sense of it. Like, I always saw it as like jazz musicians to me, like superheroes, man. They can do like anything, like musically, like the way they circumnavigate. It's like the X-Men, they have the Danger Room. You know, and the Danger Room is like, it could be at 1, or you can put it up at 10. If you put the Danger Room up at 10, that means they take all the buffers off, which means you can actually die in it, right? So it's a way to get people's attention.
That's accurate. That's
yeah,
very accurate.
You know, so I think of jazz like that. It's like, it's life or death, like you see people playing in these circumstances, and it's like people who, they get so good at it that they're bored with surviving in a certain way. So they start coming up with all these structures. Like, how can I, well, okay, diatonic scale, we got that, we got the harmonics. Like, how can I make it so that this obstacle course that they're running, harmonic obstacle course, becomes like in free fall? How do you navigate? Because I do think the black people in the Americas thing is about how you create culture in free fall. And I think jazz is such a great kind of profound kind of demonstration of that. But at a certain point, it's like people get so, it's like the main problem with the DC universe, like Justice League, right? What the hell do you do with Superman? I mean, they killed him, but they brought him right back because they can't figure out what to do with Superman because he's stronger, faster, he was outrunning the Flash. I mean, that's the fundamental problem with Superman as a character. He can kind of do anything, nothing can really stop him.
Last night, when I last saw you in L.A., you talked about who are the three people? Zod is one of them, the Phantom Zone. The villains. In Superman 2, who sometimes float down like.
Oh yeah, we were talking about the messianic.
Yeah, right. Like
messianic quality.
And I was looking for it, and I was looking for that one scene like incessantly until I fell asleep. Watching Superman 2 last night. Because I also
with Brandon Ruth, where he comes in flying like that.
Yeah.
It's very creepy.
Yeah.
Because I grew up on Superman fly like a bullet. He flies like this.
Right. But he comes in.
He comes in like Jesus. Like
yeah. Yeah, right. And there's something about positioning, right? Like, and when you watch something on the screen, like it, but you felt like he pressed forward into your zone, right?
Yeah.
Like, and that's when music like comes in to your space and it like sits around you for a second, and then it takes your backbone and it yanks it up, and you don't know what happened, right? Like I've sat in a room where stuff like that has happened, and you think you understand your body until something comes in and like triggers you into shape. So thinking about him, because when you brought him up in L.A., I could immediately recall that, and I only saw the film one time, when I was a child, how he floated into the space. Anyway, I'm sorry, man. Go back into Superman 2.
No, but I mean, that's a good, the thing is like, just in terms of what we did in London, is like I'm saying, the fundamental problem with Superman is what do you do at a certain point? So I think like with jazz, my whole thing, I've been thinking for a long time about, it's like Usain Bolt. Okay, he outrun everybody. He's breaking the world record. He's running, he waving at the camera when he gets to the finish line, So it's a little like, how do you build obstacle courses for people? So like in a way, I was like, the basic idea was like, we were gonna take an ensemble and we're going to put them in a situation like a danger room where all the things that they normally could do, like first and foremost, is they couldn't listen to each other, which is what jazz guys do. They listen to each other like intensely. They process things at a super, super quick rate. So I was like, okay, I'm going to put a trio here. I'm going to put a duo here, a solo is here, and another quartet somewhere else. And I want them to play together. I have this belief that on a quantum level, there's something that goes on the quantum level. So like even if, oh man, do I even go into this whole tangent of the Golden State Warriors and the whole thing? I said, do I go there?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so this quantum thing, okay, see, so I think like, in the ensemble, what we basically did was had a guide track that everybody heard at the same time, and it was sunk up together, right? So it all started at the same time, and people improvised against the guide track, but they couldn't hear what any other person was doing. So the question, so to speak, was like, is that just gonna be noise? Now, it very clearly was not just noise. So it's like, it was an opportunity to think about these things, but this quantum thing is like I got this whole thing about the Golden State Warriors. If you've heard me do it, talk about it before, forgive me, but basically, I think there's a way in which two things happen. Phenomena happens, and then there's an attempt to understand the phenomena. And a lot of times what happens is the attempt is what ends up dictating how we go forward, like how we understand what happens. In other words, one person will see something and say there was a miracle, and they'll build a church. Somebody else will see something and say, we need better drugs. You know what I mean? It's like different ways of responding to things that happen. And so it's like spin, basically. And so like one of the most recent ones that's been very troubling to me or exciting to me to think about is the Golden State Warriors, because in the last 3 or 4 years, you've seen that team go from a laughingstock about 6 years ago. They hired a black coach, Mark Jackson, who made them respectable. And then, like, in a sense, right on the eve of this kind of unprecedented season where they were essentially almost undefeated or something, they switched coaches because they said the management couldn't get along with Mark Jackson. And they hired Steve Kerr. And, you know, they went on to win in a very dominant fashion that year. And they've been the most dominant team in basketball since then, despite the fact that LeBron and them beat them one year. But pretty much, you know, they've been the most dominant thing. But the thing is, the way people talk about the Golden State Warriors is very interesting to me because they always frame them as they play the right way. That's what they always say. They play the right way. And that shit pissed me off, right? Because it's like totally racialized, first of all, right? Because when they say they play the right way, essentially what they're saying is like they play in a way, the white way is the right way. The white way being the way in which that's in opposition, or they try to construct it as being in opposition to the way black virtuoso basketball players play. That would be like everybody from, you know, Julius Erving, Dr. J, Connie Hawkins, Michael Jordan, LeBron James. These are like people who no one person on the face of the earth can guard. Like it's impossible to guard them, right? And so when the Golden State Warriors, they said they win because they play the right way, because they use this strategy, essentially a geospatial strategy where they move the ball quickly from one point on the floor to the other. This is the logic of it, right? If you have the ball, that's the goal. If you can move the ball quickly, you move the ball to the point on the floor where there's the least amount of resistance, right? And then you get a better shot. That's the logic of it. It's the most efficient way, and that's how Golden State, because they pass the ball. Meaning, in other words, they're playing in opposition to the way black individual virtuosos plays. Now, first of all, it's a false split because there's no great black virtuoso basketball player who ever didn't have passing as a fundamental aspect of their arsenal. Michael Jordan, LeBron James, doesn't matter who it is, because obviously it's just logical. If no one person can stop you, they have to put 2 or 3 people on you, which means somebody's always open, right? So Michael Jordan, if you look at his greatest highlights, half of them are other people hitting shots. Yeah, there is him crossing over Byron Russell, you know. but for every one of those, there's him with the ball making a move, 3 people collapse onto him, he passes to John Paxson or Steve Kerr. I mean, it's like unfortunate that the mythology around it is Jordan passes off to a white teammate, like a John Paxson, who's a sniper, an expert shooter, you know what I mean? Because that was Craig Hodges, who, you know, was great, but unfortunately Craig Hodges and these people didn't find themselves in that moment where Jordan made the move and then passed it to him. So they have this whole logic then that playing the right way is not the way Jordan actually, in fact, played, right? But Golden State Warriors, where they're moving this ball around. Now, see, to me, that's a false understanding of what's going on. That's why spin is, like, really, really important, because I do feel like in the world of progressive forces and retrograde forces, they can't control what's happening in the world, like Arab Spring or something like that, but they can name it, you know, something. They can give it a name that makes it negative or make an understanding of it. Kind of, we have a misunderstanding of it. So, with the Golden State Warriors, first of all, passing the ball. They are passing the ball, but come on. That is not evidence of passing the ball as a geophysical strategy, because they're passing the ball to Stephen Curry, who's hitting shots from 40 feet out. I mean, that's just another kind of virtuosity. And he's hitting shots with people hanging off of him. It's not like they get layups, right? So the shit just really is very irritating to me, right? It's very irritating to me, this whole idea, like, they say, okay, you just keep moving the ball like Paul, you know, like Bob Cousy, and then somebody's going to have an open look at the basket when they sit into Curry and Klay Thompson and hitting shots from crazy, you know, shots, right? Now, I think what's really happening is this, the quantum thing, and this is why it's tied to the jazz thing. The passing the ball back and forth has nothing to do with a geophysical strategy. It's a way to accumulate on a quantum level intentionality. That's what I think is happening. Meaning, in other words, it wouldn't even matter if me and Jason just passed the ball back and forth right to each other, right here, right? We could just give it to me, give it back to me, give it to me, give it back to me. I think that would make the ball more likely to go in the hole. Because everybody, like they say in basketball, they touch. Sometimes they say, did they touch it? Did the person did everybody get a touch on it? That touch on it is not because if I gave it to you and you gave it to somebody else, it went there faster. It's just because when people put their hands on it, it's like a prayer circle. It's prayer. It's like a prayer circle. So it's important for us to not get caught up in these false fictions that get constructed on what's really happening. So like in jazz is a great example of that, right? Like Fred Moten said, it was like a profound recalibration of my understanding. Because I grew up with jazz as saying the individual versus the group. You know, you got the group and then a person in that very American, Western way. They become an individual and they stand up like Superman and they assert themselves in the face of the group. And Fred said something that was a small thing, but he said, like, no, it's not the group versus the individual. The individual or the soloist is an emanation of the group. And the way I always visualize it is like, if anybody's seen my work, a lot of times my video work, I always have an image of the sun. And that's one of the things the sun is about, because I think the solar flare is the best example of that. Because you don't think of a solar flare, the sun is blazing, the solar flare goes off. It doesn't just go off into space and become a proto-sun or something, become its own thing. It comes out, it stretches out of the body of the thing, makes this incredible display, and then it's absorbed back into the body. So to me, that's a great example of not getting caught up in somebody's misdefinition of what's actually going on. Because what that does is that turns us away from our own resources, in a sense. Because, you know, we be saying like this, and that, and it's improvisation, but somebody else is calling something else, and before we know it, we start foregrounding composition again in a certain kind of way. You know, or even the whole split between improvisation and composition is false. It's like a false as a total split between the two. Because everybody who composes is improvising a little bit, and everybody who improvises, in my understanding, you can correct me, has a lot of compositional logic in their head.
And the other side is also the person who plays basketball and has the ball a lot is called a hog.
Yeah.
And the person who solos a lot is also called a hog. And in those relationships, in a group setting, when someone is out front in their moment, in their solo moment, what generally happens with the best bands is you're listening to the solos, not just say what they need to say, but listen to everybody else right around them, and also respond to what'd you just say? You know, they say, what did you just say to the audience too? And then you feel that, right? This is what makes us listen to records over and over and over again, is because we still are trying to piece together parts of the conversation, even though we heard the song 300 times, but I still need to hear, you know, Jerry Allen play that song again, because what she plays in that moment, I still don't understand. And maybe if I listen to it in the car, maybe that'll help, you know? But it really, it doesn't get old, but it also becomes a misnomer with how we understand what jazz is, because it is this kind of like, beyond this Wild Western thing, is like, well, if I have to consider who Miles Davis is, I really have to consider who his band is. He ain't nothing without that band there. Now, he's crazy enough, and I mean crazy enough, to keep firing his band and hiring an entirely new ensemble to totally reframe him and make a new folder. But not all musicians are like that, or as brave as that too. He's willing to sacrifice every bit of his catalog every 8 or 10 years and to say, I'm gonna start brand new again, and I'm gonna do it with these people. But not every musician does that. And I have found that the ones who have been, that there's a longer run to have by being most generous in these moments to allow the conversation to inflect how you speak, so that you then trade words rather than, I'm just out here saying my thing. There's another term in jazz that musicians use for each other when a soloist is just only gonna say a thing to rile a crowd up, and not in like an artistic way, but in a kind of just rile them up, messily. We'll call it getting house.
Getting house.
Getting house. Like that's the house. Like this is the audience, the house, right? And so if I say something, they go, ooh, you know, like that, right? Like right now, you have to contemplate in that moment, okay, what did I say to make them say that? Or like, Kenny G will hold a note for a long time. People will go crazy. That's getting house. That's a version of getting house. And so this hog, this house, like this space, this stage, you know, that generally in our best sense we describe as a place for transportive, you know, kind of, I don't know, kind of mobility, you know, downward and upward, many times is a hog's pit. Many times. It's happening right now in some club on the other side of the earth. A hog is up there taking a solo. And so also the mythology around jazz is that it is always in this kind of like ideal space, when that is not the true case either. It's a unfortunate part of how when a form continues. Now we're entering our centennial, 100th year or over 100 years. As a form moves, then how does it really still maintain its like some original findings that kept it moving forward? Now it's taught in schools, and I'm a part of this system too as a teacher. Then how do I make sure to yank a kid hard enough so that that kid understands that it's much more about their mother and going to see Superman or whatever, Space Odyssey, As a child, that's going to be the thing that's going to transform their work, not me telling you what scale to play. And that realization was a thing that I had to realize by leaving Houston, and I think all these players who play together by leaving their homes and coming to this place where now they practice a routine together, but have to improvise in that moment. That then gets us to have to change our language by how we experience a group or a band or a work, And
I was the other day explaining what happened, with these multi-sites, and then you bringing it all together to Kamasi, Washington. And when we discussed it, you were wondering about the performative part of it, and that brought it, of course, also to the choreography. There was a choreography part involved, and also a vinyl part involved. Can you tell us that?
The choreography part?
Yeah, because there was a...
Oh, yeah. Well, Okwi Akpo Swasili, who's just the most amazing performer, dancer, performer. She was like, what happened was, so Jason was at the Dirty House, which is David Adjaye's masterpiece, like early masterpiece, residential house. Steve Coleman and Kakai were at Aduro Olawu's fashion place. And initially Gibbs and Morgan Kraft and Micah Guy, they were in a boxing ring, but we had, as things happened, a little bit of problem with that. So they ended up in another space. But the whole idea was that, okay, they have this track. Everybody's hearing this track that's in sync. They're improvising against it. But for the audience just heard piped in the different musical strands that were being produced, but not the guide track that Jason and the other musicians were hearing. In other words, we just heard what you guys created in response to this guide track. And there was a dancer there. Okwi was there dancing in front of the audience, which for me, I don't know, like that was something that kind of held it together for the audience too, because she, again, was like interpreting it as well, But I do, this just goes back again to the quantum thing. It's really just how to involve a group of folks in an endeavor where the normal resources that they have, because I do think one of the most amazing things with black folks is like how we make anything happen. You know what I mean? And I think like back to slave ships and stuff, there's this complicated relationship between being literally bound to another person who you may or you may not know, right? And that creates this dynamic in black folks where on one hand, we congregate because that being bound up is something we're both familiar with, and it's something that we've done to survive, but at the same time, because we were bound non-consensually, we also have this drive to individuate ourselves. So that tension is always in place. So I'm always amazed when black people pull things off together, because it kind of goes against the grain of physics a lot of times as we even understand it. Causality. It's like a kind of counter-causality into the way things make it. So for me, it was really an opportunity to demonstrate almost like that superpower. Like here we are, we're going to show you what this superpower looks like, because we can put these people in metal boxes, in individual places, and nevertheless they'll be able to harmonize like the Jubilee Gospel Singers or something, So to me, that was kind of it.
And now you started this collaboration. I'm sure more is going to happen. What's next? Are there any projects you want to do together? Or?
With Jason, you mean?
Yeah, the two of
I'm
you.
always like beating up his cell phone. He knows. I'll be sending him like posts in the middle of the night. Jason, I had this idea. What about this?
And then that's followed by, I'm going to send you this playlist, right? And this playlist about 30 songs, Or, years ago when I was on the train talking, you said, I have this theory about how images of black people work together, And then he sent me about 500 images, and said, look at this series of images. Now, then I didn't, right? And then until I saw the show at Serpentine, did I really understand, like, where you were moving towards with these books that he makes, which are these series of these images, which is basically like his testaments or his volumes of of how images work against one another or with each other or on top of each other or reflect off of one another or block the other. So we kind of constantly, there's probably about 3 things still in play right now that we're thinking about.
Like I was even telling Hans, like I'm like one of the things that Jason's heard me talk about something that's like in cinema, I'm really on this big thing of like no direct sound. Like not recording sound when you shoot. So like in Italian films, they post-dub everything. So all the voices are like, it's like a cartoon, like the Smurfs. Who you see and who's talking is a completely different thing. So I'm really on this idea of making these movies, like, proper movies with actors and that kind of stuff. But we post-dub all the stuff like we do it, like they did in Italy and stuff. But what I want to auto-tune everybody's voice. So like everybody in the movie to be talking individually, but everybody's gonna have their own specific auto-tune tweak. But I want to make it an instrument that I'm calling the grill, and I want you to play it. So like, so like you'd have all these voices that record individual, but then somebody like Jason would be basically manipulated in real time, which is just another way to try to take his resources, the harmonic complexity of his brain, but put him in a situation where, you know what I mean, you're gonna be forced to use some muscles you don't necessarily use, or use muscles in conjunction with each other in a way that you don't necessarily use them, as opposed to just sitting there and tweaking the voices. It's like how do we invent like an alternate universe of black cinema? Because in a lot of ways, it's like we don't have the legacy systems. You know what I mean? So we can do whatever we want to do. So.
Yeah, and that last part, we can do whatever we want to do, is rarely probably exhibited. For sometimes it's financial, sometimes it's space, resources, and the things that live in people's minds is unrealized. Sometimes are often better there, probably, but then every once in a while, and it's pretty clear when we see it, when it comes into existence, when you see a work, and it's like, oh, I'm glad they got that out of their head. Like right. For me, first time I saw Killer of Sheep on screen, I was like, I'm glad that Charles Burnett got that out of his mind, and so that years later that I could see that and know that that was possible, that we could have, as a people, that much complexity and also that much timbre, in how our lives, our domestic lives, our public lives, our work lives, how all that really works together. And then also hearing how he manipulated music in that way, And I just had not experienced a film like that, and here was a student in the 70s who makes this masterpiece, which for me is the best thing I've ever seen in my life.
It is. And the thing about it, and this is just to go back to the musicians for 1 second. Okay, as a folks, we're like forced to lay down. I mean, slave ship, you have to lay down. You chain down, you have to lay down. So if a person stands up, that's a big deal. Because it shows everybody that it's possible to stand up. And musicians in particular, not just jazz musicians, but musicians in particular, like I like to say, they're radically self-determined. So when you see a musician doing that thing, it's deeper than just doing a musical thing. It's a philosophical thing. Like to me, when jazz guys improvise, before it's a musical gesture, it's a philosophical gesture, because it's like saying, in an environment where we're not supposed to be self-determined, we will be self-determined. I mean, even more self-determined than if you're playing a score, because if you're playing a score, ultimately, there's somebody still over you. You're playing a composition. But if you're improvising, if you're making it up, you are being self-determined. Like to me, when Miles turns his back, it's like, I'm not only gonna be self-determined, I'm not only gonna be the nigga who does what he wants to do, I'm gonna do it with my back to y'all. So that's why I always think, that's why I say, the musicians to me are like superheroes in a sense, because they show us all how to stand up,
Now, my last question before we open it up to all of your questions is, and it's in the realm of the unrealized, because I am very interested in notions of unrealized projects, because there's so many different forms of unrealized projects too big to be realized or too smart to be realized. Doris Lessing once told me that, of course, also the projects which have been censored, but also the project that maybe hasn't dared to do, Doris Lessing talked about self-censor projects. But then, of course, there are also the projects which in a way have to do with production of reality, unrealized projects which have to do with going beyond the idea of doing concerts or exhibitions. And that leads us very much to what I said in the introduction, this idea of building institutions. And in this Current Climate. We had last year the conversation where Claudia Rankin said, she talked about the Racial Imaginary Institute and talked about this necessity to found new institutions. This week, actually Brian Stevenson, who moderated the talk with Charles Gaines, was in Miami and talked a lot about the museum he's founding as an institution in Alabama, from enslavement to mass incarceration, an initiative of the Equal Justice Initiative. And I know that both of you have been thinking a lot about that, and I have to find now the note, because AJ, you told me actually this morning about an institution you are imagining, the Agatha institution. So I wanted to ask you both to talk about that, this idea of urgent 21st century, new structures, new institutions, artist-run institutions.
Well, basically, Agatha Institute is I did that I had for years and years and years, and I kind of just said, but in the last 18 months, I was like, oh shit, I can maybe do this now. And basically, having grown up in the Mississippi Delta, I oftentimes refer to it as the Black Jurassic Park. There's just a lot of, like live dinosaurs, like culturally there. And so I always wanted to, in a sense, go back home and start a think tank that was going to be based in the Delta. Because a lot of black folks, too, have never even been to Mississippi or haven't been to the Delta. So I think it's a place that folks should go, because in some ways it's got like ground zero for American black musical culture in the States. Ground zero, I would say. Maybe New Orleans would be the only other place. But ground zero, so if it's ground zero for black musical culture, that means it's ground zero for American musical culture, which means it's ground zero for American culture. So that place is a very intense place to sort of, to experience. And so I always thought, like, in conjunction with creating a context where people could go down and experience it, we would also be able to create like some kind of think tank or something where people could come down. And just like any other think tank, you have like-minded individuals, you put them into a context. It's all a danger room again. It's just you put people in a context where mixes happen, where you get these people inflect each other, they influence or, because sometimes like, I would just make an analogy, people laying down, people stand up, but we know the world is really way more complicated than that, because it's not just laying down and standing up. There's all these modalities, sort of on other dimensionalities between laying down and standing up. There's all these other things you can do, like dance, you know what I mean? So it's not as simple as laying down and standing up. So you kind of get that when you actually interact with other people in a certain kind of way. So I don't even consider that such an unrealizable project. I feel like that's one that's going to kind of happen. Yeah,
that will. And if anything, the thing that he mentions is a return to home, which is if more people did that, I lightly might say that the place would be better. This place, America, would be better if more thoughtful people return to the places where they reflect on so frequently. Do I reflect on what I learned in Houston, Texas? And I return there and I do work there, but it's not like setting up shop there and making sure that continues, that work continues. Based on also then what I took from Houston and now have moved all around the world and seen these other things that you need to come back and say, okay, what's around the corner that we didn't even consider, and that home part, I always thought that there needed to be a real Black Mountain College, not like a real one, and a place where I just don't know where it exists yet. It doesn't exist yet, and I think it's a conspiracy to keep those kinds of brains apart from each other, and because we aren't even really sure what that then unleashes in a future generation. I think that somebody will have to, that's the thing that lives kind of unrealized in my mind, that maybe 15 years from now. But people are kind of making modes of it now. Yeah. And that makes, like, so when I go into Chicago, if I play a show, then afterwards I call Theaster, then I go to the South Side, we go eat, and we go listen to music, and then we go talk till 3 in the morning, and then I leave, and then we stay in contact, and we see how to slowly build these things in public.
Yeah, Theaster was the first person I called when I said, I guess I got an institute, I got to have a board. He was literally the first person I called because he's done such incredible stuff in terms of building infrastructure, and he was, excited to say, yeah, I'm down. But so, we know like there are imperatives to keep, like you were suggesting, to keep these things from happening. I mean, it's no accident that all the, slave codes and stuff, they have all these rules and regulations about how many people get to gather, because they understand that the gathering is where things actually happen. Things get transformative, So, and that's why it's no accident that all the great political movements, gatherings happen in churches, because the church was the one exception. They were so concerned with getting people to buy into the Christian thing that they allowed people to break that fundamental rule of gathering. So like even in South Africa, somewhere like that, it was like all the big political rallies came out of funeral gatherings, because that was also one of the instances where the government would sort of allow people to gather more than 2 or 3, and they would always turn into these big political rallies because, people inspire other people. I mean, it's catalytic. Gathering is a catalytic thing. It's why human beings gather, why they gather around fire. They gather because it's a catalytic kind of thing. It's a neural net. It's like people's nervous system syncing up. So.
Could not be a better conclusion. Let's open it up. Do we have questions for AJ, for Jason? I've got a question here. If you can please have the microphone in the middle, second row.
I run an archive that has a fairly large contribution of jazz imagery in it. So I want to make a few comments. One, not to scare you, but Superman is more of a resource, an inheritance than most people think. There's a West African version of it called Knee Child. And this was a child miraculously born from his mother's knee, and who went on to accomplish amazing things. So I think we should keep that referencing of acknowledging what really belongs to us, our inheritance here. Also, in that vein, I want to mention Ornette Coleman, and because we lost him recently, and also John Coltrane, who went all over the world absorbing and querying musical traditions, and came home and, according to some people, was headed back to the blues at the end of his life. Could you comment on blues knowledge and its importance in your work? Thank you.
I mean, he's from the Delta. Blues knowledge. Well, one thing, Ornette Coleman, maybe 9 months before he passed, I'll say this is the blues for me. It's like going to his apartment in New York City and sitting down with him and him saying, well, you want to play some pool? He didn't say it like that, but let's just say he did. You want to play some pool? And I said, sure. So he has this beautiful pool table, this open floor, kind of, open plan kind of apartment he lives in. And so, rack the balls, set it up. I go down and I break the rack, the balls spray across the table. It's his shot. He walks to the table, he puts his stick on the table and just goes. My ass is like, okay. And then he takes the cue ball and he puts it down. He sees like 2 ball over there near the pocket, and he shoots it in, right? Then he takes another ball, like the 7, puts it over near a pocket, puts the cue ball back in place, and he shoots it in. And he keeps doing this for about 10 minutes. Then he looks up and he says, are you doing what you want to do? I said, yep. He said, ain't nothing wrong with that, And so we did that. We didn't trade it shots. It wasn't a game. It was now just a session about shooting, right? And I don't know, like for Ornette, like he changed also the notion of the blues. And we're both from Texas, And so that tradition of what Texas blues is means a lot to us, But it also means that it's movable, And in that moment, it was like one of the most profound music lessons, because he said, no, you set this up the way you want it to be. You don't set up your strategy to shoot yourself in the foot. You set it up for you to succeed. How do you set up the game? How do you set up your music? How does Muddy Waters set up the music? How does Robert Johnson set up the music, you know? How does Sister Rosetta set up the music for that to have its most powerful place, right? And I don't know, like when I'm listening to Skip James play blues, or when I'm really listening to like people who I think lay it down, got a few chances. It wasn't like this, like right now I could turn on my phone and make a record, or, you know, nothing like that. But it was like, no, you have a chance to make something, and you have about 2 minutes. And what can you do in that moment? That is like the most profound thing. It's the thing that I measure kind of my work against. It's like, will you be able to make something that kind of like, that really is powerful? I mean, Carrie Weems has a new piece that she has with Mary J. Blige in it called The Blues, you know, or something The Blues. Like, it's the thing that we all have to come back to kind of like frame ourselves against.
Well, yeah, it's like blues knowledge, black people's knowledge. It's like I said, I always go to the music, you know, for me it's like a great point of reference. Just even hearing you talk about the on-air thing, like that's deep to me. My thing increasingly now is trying to understand my mama. Because my mom be calling me on the phone, like on the cell phone in the middle of the night, depending on where I am. She be saying some totally avant-garde kind of shit, you know, like for real. I'm not just trying to be ironic, but it's like for real. She's saying some crazy shit, you know. And I've taken the time to record my mom's conversations, you know. My dad he had a stroke about 8 or 9 years ago, so he's more gnomic now. Like, you know, he'll just blurt something out. I think that's more like something about the angularity of that reminds me of Monk. There's something slightly spastic about it. But my mom is just, she just be going. You know, she always starts off with like, guess who passed? These days, it's always about who passed.
I've heard that since.
She started, guess who passed? Guess who passed? And then she go on to talk about anything, you know, had nothing to do with that, you know. But like to me, like on some kind of cognitive level, I'm like, if I could just understand the logic of how she gets from A to B, then I would truly have discovered the, you know, the kind of holy grail.
Yeah, but you know, he came to Rome this summer. My family was at the American Academy in Rome, and he had just shown he was coming to visit Rome to see Gavin's gallery. And so we all went to dinner. So my kids and AJ
my
and
son,
his
my mom,
and
my
his mom,
sister.
yeah. So we all had this dinner. So I know what he's kind of like talking about, because any person who really deals with what the blues has to deal with how they figured themselves into their own ancestry, right? So I thought I had learned how to play the blues, and I went to Houston and played it. My grandfather said, "Boy, that ain't no blues," and walked away. And I thought, oh, damn, you know. And then I went back and I you know, then I had to start to understand what it was, because also the person who really made me know that I didn't know anything about it was Cassandra Wilson. And when I graduated college, I was on tour with her in Japan, and we were playing these songs, and she was playing Robert Johnson songs, Miles Davis, like playing all these songs that, you know, you had to dig all the way down. I'm 22 years old. I know nothing about digging down.
Right.
I ain't learned it yet. And at one point, she just said, she said a lot. I won't paraphrase it now, but she's the one who said, "Boy, you need to go think about this," right?
Right.
And I sat with Marvin Sewell, who is still one of my best friends to this day, guitarist and great historian of the instrument. And he said, "No, let's think about this for a while." And then when you go around the world, then you hear the same thing in other music. So whether I listen to Okinawan singing, or whether I listen to drummers in Senegal, you know, when I hear the voice and how it works around the world, then I know that, oh no, this is actually that melody that everybody knows about. That's also what makes it.
Oh man, I was with Mancha Dia Warrior in Mali, in Nia Fonke. Now, first of all, just having a town named Nia Fonke is an achievement in itself. But Ali Farka Touré essentially owned this town, right? It was like towards Timbuktu and all of that. And we get there, and it was just like on so many levels. It was a trip, but like he said, I'm gonna take you to hear the Hunters music. We got in this boat, and we paddle over there, and these cats was playing. It was like straight up Skip James. Right. Like literally, not sort of like it. It just sounded like early, like country blues. Like just except they were singing in, with a Wolof or whatever they were singing in. But the music itself was really, I was really amazed at it's like being in another part of the world and seeing somebody who looks just like you or just like your cousin. Like I was in Benin and I seen this cat look like my cousin Malcolm. And it was crazy because I was walking around in this, in a market. It was a market. So I was having one epiphany, right? The first epiphany was this. I'm walking around in this market and I'm looking at these people and it's like being on the deck of Babylon 6 or Star Trek or something. Because the extremes of the features of the people. They just have like crazy, like you see African sculpture and they be saying, oh, it's abstract, it's stylized. Till you see a cat look just like that sculpture. With eyes on the side of his head and shit like this, right? So I'm walking around and I'm thinking like, oh yeah, this whole conception of abstraction comes from the sort of impossibility, the unimaginability on the part of Europeans. When they first saw the sculptures, they said, oh, this shit is stylized. Because could no human being actually look like that? The shit is abstract. It's abstracted, right? Until you actually see people who look like that, right? So I'm walking around in Benin in this market thinking it's like, wow, this is really deep. Then I see a cat who looked just like my cousin Malcolm. So it's something in there, I think, some in there.
Do we have more questions? Yeah, we've got a question here.
By the way, the conversation is quite interesting, how you guys talk. I'm from South Africa, Johannesburg, and then I run my own cultural space. It's been over 10.
Where you from?
South Africa, Johannesburg. Yeah, I run my own cultural space there. And we were doing this project with the British Council, and we invited Colcat, the founders of Ninja Tunes, to come and sort of do a collaborative project, at the same time doing a workshop in Soweto. And then I introduced, one of the musicians was the son of Philippe Tabane, which at the time Hans was able to meet while he was in South Africa with us. But Philippe Tabane plays the Malombo music. He didn't want to travel the world because his music kept being framed as jazz. So he pulled back. He's like one of those artists that just like live in the far off parts of the world in a way, but he lives in South Africa still, but like he lives alone by himself because he doesn't want to fall within the traps of how he's termed, the music is termed. So his son was part of the sort of the group that we put together to collaborate with Colcat, Ninja Tune, for instance. Then it comes in that format of music. What's the right way to do music? So when Colcat, when they came to South Africa to do this process, they already had this thought process of how this collaboration is going to work. And here we have this sort of intense young musicians that are following a certain narrative in South Africa right now. Again, not to be disturbed by the Western formality of how music's supposed to sound like. And then there was this clash between sort of them and these young musicians. And then the age group, again, is intergenerational, is different. So there was this fight between how this music will sound and the direction it will take, and it was quite an intense, even though the music was created at the end of the day, it was not realized between a more collaborative process. It was more of a dictated how the process is supposed to sound like. And we told them throughout the whole thing. But again, it goes back to how Europe sees music and then how young South Africans are trying to sort of carve a new way of seeing music. And then also I just want to comment on, I was in Berlin and then I met Stella Shiweshe, the queen of Mbira. She's like super old and she plays like this spiritual content through her music. And she was on stage and then the audience was super wide. And I just want to ask around the messaging of music. So the audience was super wide and she's playing and then she's narrating at the same time, doing a storytelling process. No one in the audience heard a single thing. It just went over their head. And then few black people in the audience will respond to that kind of content. And afterwards, we were backstage with her. We're collaborating with her for the Berlin project that we're doing. But we went backstage, it's like, what is messaging in the music and who are your audiences also? Because most of the time it's like, where do we get to perform? Where do we get to talk like this in these conversations? And who are the people that's supposed to be reaching this sort of, this message that you guys are talking about? So the messaging, where does it reach and where does it end at the end of the day? So I just want to ask about then the content of the idea of messaging when we get to perform in international spaces and when we get to perform back home. I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, I mean, it's so funny because about maybe 4 or 5 months ago, when they would set up interviews in London mostly, and I started getting a series of questions, and I realized people were starting to read the press releases a little bit, like the gallery had started compiling previous interviews, so the people who were interviewing me were actually reading the previous interviews. And so you started seeing a series of questions come in that, like the same person that asked the same question. And the one question that everybody asked me was like, I saw in the interview where you said you making your art for black people. Okay, I'm white, so does that mean you don't want me to like your art or something like that? It's like, and I said, no, I didn't say I was making my art. I make my art for myself, first of all. That's what I make it for. I said I was addressing black people. And that's critical. That's a critical distinction that's really important. Like, in other words, I'm speaking to black people. That's what I do. I may change in the future. I don't know. But for now, that's what I do. I speak to black people. Everybody else gets to listen in. I'm so happy for other people to listen in. I'm excited that people want to listen in, right? But I'm talking to very specific people, right? It's like Eric Clapton. That's a good example, came up to me. When he does Layla, I said this example in London because everybody got it. It's like when he makes the song Layla, that song is addressing his best friend Joyce Harrison's wife, Patty Hansen, who he had fallen in love with his best friend's wife. And he was so fraught about the whole thing, he wrote this incredibly great song, right? He's not singing to everybody. He's singing to Patty Hansen. Everybody else gets to listen in. Okay, so that's one aspect of it, like the authenticity of like who you are addressing. The other thing is this, and this is kind of like to the degree that I have any sort of mission statement around this, like, look, in the world is complicated, right? There's a lot of different positions, opinions, understandings, complexity in the world. One of the things that black people are really good at and women are really good at is the ability to go to experience something that's not where the person's not speaking to you and still get something out of it. Like the empathy muscle is very, very developed, right? I know, like I grew up, all these things, 2001. Ain't no black people in 2001, right? But these things had a profound impact on me because I have a very highly developed empathy muscle. Like I can go and look at a thing that don't have no black people in it and have a really good experience, right? Same thing with women. They see mostly things coming from men, like, and they have that ability to do that. White men mostly they don't get to develop that muscle, right? So the point I'm trying to make is this. I'm not helping nobody. I'm not helping white folks if I talk to you guys, because you get that all the time. So I'm addressing who it is, my mama or my friends, that's who I'm speaking to. That is the best possible thing you could be checking out. It's somebody who's not speaking to you, and the ability, and I'm generalizing that, but the ability to be able to listen in, where it's not the fuck about you for a second, and still, as a human being, be able to get something from it. So I'm very happy when people like my work, but no, I'm not talking to you.
Jason, something you want to say about?
I only caught the tail end of the conversation, but or the question, but about messaging, and the history of how I've understood. Let's say if I just narrow it down to my relationship with jazz music and Burt Williams' messaging, where he writes a song called "Nobody" that becomes a hit. And then, like 1906, like millions of people buy his wax cylinder. He gets sick of the song, and he writes another song called "Somebody." And then he writes another song called "Everybody." This is before Solowit, all them. This is like black conceptual thinking before 1920. And it's a relationship to himself. It's a critique of where he is. And I think what the music that I function in, what it does is self-critical first, because you put yourself next to the next person, right? And you say that you're different, and that's actually the reason you're working together, is that you're different. You might be from the same neighborhood, but y'all play different instruments and use different language to make jazz work together. what maybe miraculously what a person like Louis Armstrong and his wife Lil Hardin did was they had this band in the Hot Five, where it's seemingly 5 people playing nonsense together somehow weaves itself in front of each audience member that listens to it. So, but now as that music has traveled the world, right, now that people also find their own history in it, whether they're living in Japan or living in Australia or living in South Africa, that then they also then have to find themselves. This is one of the great unlocking mechanisms that jazz has been able to kind of set in place for Polish communities, for Cuban communities, for Brazilian communities, is that you're able to place yourself in the pantheon. This is actually what's freeing. Now, Brahms also might say that, but he ain't setting it up for you. Like the whole mode that we have set up that I'm a part of now, 100 years later, is the mode for you to set yourself inside the music. So if I have a song where I interview my grandparents and I chop out every ancestor's name that they say in this conversation and I lay them all in a row and I play the song and I record it and people hear it all around the world, the point isn't for them to hear what Southern black names sound like coming out of black Southern twangy voices. That ain't the point. The point is like, well, who are your people? Like it always is asking, who are you to even listen to this and want to listen to this? And what will you get out of it? And it's that challenging part, which then demands that the audience kind of like find themselves in it. I mean, you walk out here, you go into the center, you're placing yourself in front of the work. That's the first thing you have to realize. And maybe Adrian Piper kind of also, when I first saw her retrospective in Barcelona, I felt like it was the first work that I had seen where she pointed directly in my eye, and I felt like her finger was 1 inch away from my face, right? And so I felt like that was messaging, right? Like, here I was, the only black person walking through MACBA in Barcelona and looking at her work, and I know that she was jabbing me in my gut, right? And checking every position I was standing at. And when I asked her about it, she said, oh, I intentionally make my work to be eye level with the human who walks in front of it. Like, she's like, no, I'm placing it so that it interrogates you when you stand in front of it. It's not passive, it's aggressive. And so my messaging sometimes when I'm playing is to actually to throw those charges out into the audience so that people feel like it is pointed.
And you said the other day in an interview where you actually said we have to promote the abstract. You talked about the audience and you said that improvised music forces us to focus on our own ideas and how important it is that actually the audience makes their own decision. And you then said, most importantly, is to kind of see the audience as thinkers. Can you maybe tell us a little bit about that?
Well, I don't know. I mean, over years, sometimes the language around, let's say, jazz gets codified in a way where you only hear certain kinds of terms all the time around it, about what it means. And I generally think that anybody should be able to say anything they want to about it. And I almost don't even care what people think. But I want them to feel something in it. But I also want them to feel like they should let themselves live in a world where they should be confused most of the time. Because that's definitely what's on CNN right now, is confusion, right? They definitely put it on TV for you to see like hour after hour, and then here's a commercial that's also confusing, right? That's hour after hour. Right, so we see these modes, but now do we listen to music that does this too, right? So do we listen to music outside of the frame of an image, right? Do you sit in a dark room, or besides the modes of kind of walking around with earphones or in a car, do we ever have those contemplative moments when listening to a piece of music? That's why people should still show up for concerts centuries later. They do that because they need to go to a place to really focus on it. And you sit in a room together, and it's not passive that you're sitting in a row of people in a dark room to watch one thing come to life that doesn't have necessarily, you can't hold it in your hand. And those moments for me have been transformative, to have these experiences of standing and listening in dark rooms. So I always think that, somebody else should want to do that too.
Well, there were several things you said that brought to mind my favorite Andy Warhol quote. He says, everybody should fall in love with their eyes closed, which I just think is so great, because what it's really about is saying, we're so used to looking at things using a certain perceptual modality, but when you select a person or when you are drawn to a person, there's something to be said about taking it offline of the way you normally perceive and then, hearing them. Like, I fell in love with that person because I heard their voice, or I rubbed against them a certain kind of way. It's something about, like when you say the insistence on the abstraction, I think it's like that. It's like language, words sometimes, it's too indexical, it's too specific. You know what I mean? It doesn't really force people to bring a full engagement of themselves into the actual perception and the sort of experience of the work. And that's why, like, to me, I think the abstraction thing is good. I'm like super committed to things that have complexity. It goes back to the 2001. I just want to be buried alive. I just want to be lost in something, you know, because I think that ability to be lost in something in the area of social media and every Google Maps and all this stuff is something increasingly
When's your birthday?
valuable. November 30th.
Oh, that's right. November 30th.
30th, yeah.
Maybe take one last question. Yeah, we've got a question here. If you can have the mic, please.
Excuse me for jumping in. Y'all didn't really need me today. But great talk, by the way, fellas. But I heard a name called out that I rarely hear, which is Philip Tabani. I actually played on Philip Tabani's None Such record. So I kind of wanted to address this whole thing about dealing with collaboration and space. I mean, if you're running the space, you're in charge. If you don't feel like the collaboration is happening, it's your job to kind of force it. I mean, over the years, playing jazz, you know, I remember going to Germany for the first time in 1980, playing with somebody from Texas, playing this kind of Texas-based avant blues music. And of course, the people aren't going to get any of the references. But your job, I like the way AJ framed it on a certain level. Your job is to tell your story to the people. And what they get is what they get. But it's also a question of letting them know that there's another way of framing life. So now that people like yourself are moving into positions of being in charge of what that framing looks like, make sure the framing is what you want it to be. That's all I wanted to say about that.
You want to comment on?
Oh, I got a comment on it? I thought my comment was clapping.
Great. So a very last question to both of you. I see also, you know, many young artists here in the room, and Rainer Maria Rilke wrote this amazing little book, which is an advice to a young poet. I was wondering what both of you in 2017 would give as an advice to a young artist.
I mean, I don't really give this advice to young artists. It's just a thing I constantly tell myself. And if people ask me, you know, what I think or my opinion about something, it's just another version of what Melvin was just saying. Just be specific. You know, I always try to be specific in what I do. I try to be specific. I try to not get caught up in how the thing necessarily is going to be received. Like, I'm thinking of, like, one of the more profound examples of that for me is, like, years ago when I was doing a talk around Daughters of the Dust, which I worked on with Julie Dash in the early 90s. But we screened it at this classroom. I thought it was a classroom. Like, I'm going to the classroom, we get there, and there's like 500 people there. And this guy he does these TV things, he does classes, and they go and see a movie. So that everybody had seen the movie. We screened the film, people were making comments, and this lady in the front row, white lady, progressive, you know, she stood up and said, when I see that grandmother in that movie, I don't see color. I see my own grandmother. And I remember immediately saying, and I knew she was progressive, she was thinking positive. I said, but how come you can't see her color and see your grandmother? Why are those two things are split? You know what I'm saying? Why do we have to be less black in order for it to be quote unquote universal? Like, we should be able to be specifically who we are. And the issue of whether people can identify with that or not, or get with that, that's their issue. It's an opportunity, like I said, with the empathy muscle. It's an opportunity for them to actually understand somebody else's understanding of the world. But our job, as Gibbs was saying, is to be specific.
Jason?
I'm at a point where I need rest, so I always say to an artist, get some rest. And rest in music means shut up.
AJ and Jason, thank you so much. Thank you all very much.